"Never," answered the naturalist, "but I am in hopes I shall have a chance of doing so very soon." "Surely you don't imagine yourself in Africa," said Tom suddenly. "Africa? No, why should I?" replied Benedict. "But as I have already seen a tsetse in America, I do not despair of having the satisfaction of discovering white ants there too. You do not know the sensation I shall make in Europe when I publish my folio volume and its illustrations." It was evident that no inkling of the truth had yet entered poor Benedict's brain, and it seemed likely that it would require demonstration far more striking than any natural phenomena to undeceive the minds of such of the party as were not already in possession of the fatal secret. Although it was 9 o'clock, Cousin Benedict went on talking incessantly, regardless of the fact that one by one his audience were falling to sleep in their separate cells. Dick Sands did not sleep, but neither did he interrupt the entomologist by farther questions. Hercules kept up his attention longer than the rest, but at length he too succumbed to weariness, and his eyes and ears were closed to all external sights and sounds. But endurance has limits, and at last Cousin Benedict, having worn himself out, clambered up to the topmost cell of the cone, which he had chosen for his dormitory, and fell into a peaceful slumber. The lantern had been already extinguished. All was darkness and silence within, whilst the storm without still raged with a violence that gave no sign of abatement. Dick Sands himself was the only one of the party who was not partaking in the repose that was so indispensable to them all. But he could not sleep. His every thought was absorbed in the responsibility that rested on him to rescue those under his charge from the dangers that threatened them. Again and again, he recalled every incident that had occurred since the loss of Captain Hull and his crew. He remembered the occasion when he had stood with his pistol pointed at Negoro's head. Why, oh why, had his hand faltered then? Why had he not at that moment hurled the miserable wretch overboard, and thus relieved himself and his partners in trouble from the catastrophe that had since befallen them? Peril was still staring them in the face, and his sole drop of consolation in the bitter cup of despondency was that Mrs. Weldon was still ignorant of their real situation. At that moment, just in the fever of his agony, he felt a light breath upon his forehead. A hand was laid upon his shoulder, and a gentle voice murmured in his ear, "My poor boy, I know everything. God will help us. His will be done." Illustration: My poor boy, I know everything. Chapter 6. A diving bell. This sudden revelation that Mrs. Weldon was acquainted with the true state of things left Dick speechless. Even had he been capable of replying, she gave him no opportunity, but immediately retired to the side of her son. The various incidents of the march had all gradually enlightened her, and perhaps the exclamation of Cousin Benedict on the preceding evening had crowned them all. Anyhow, the brave lady now knew the worst. Dick felt, however, that she did not despair, neither would he. He lay and longed for the dawn, when he hoped to explore the situation better, and perchance to find the watercourse which he was convinced could not be far distant. Moreover, he was extremely anxious to be out of the reach of the natives whom, it was only too likely, Negoro and Harris might be putting on their track. But as yet no glimmer of daylight penetrated the aperture of the cone, whilst the heavy rumblings, deadened as they were by the thickness of the walls, made it certain that the storm was still raging with undiminished fury. Attentively Dick listened, and he could distinctly hear the rain beating around the base of the ant-hill. The heavy drops splashed again as they fell, in a way altogether different to what they would upon solid ground, so that he felt sure that the adjacent land was by this time completely flooded. He was getting very drowsy when it suddenly occurred to him that it was not unlikely the aperture was getting blocked up with damp clay. In that case, he knew that the breath of the inmates would quickly vitiate the internal atmosphere. He crept along the ground, and had the satisfaction of finding that the clay embankment was still perfectly dry. The orifice was quite unobstructed, allowing not only a free passage to the air, but admitting the glare of the occasional flashes of lightning, which the descending volumes of water did not seem to stay. Having thus far satisfied himself that all was well, and that there was no immediate danger, Dick thought that he might now resign himself to sleep as well as the rest. He took the precaution, however, of stretching himself upon the embankment within easy reach of the opening, and with his head supported against the wall, after a while dozed off. How long his light slumber had lasted he could not say, when he was aroused by a sensation of cold. He started up, and to his horror discovered that the water had entered the anthill and was rising rapidly. It could not be long, he saw, before it reached the cells which were occupied by Hercules and Tom. He woke them at once, and told them what he had observed. The lantern was soon lighted, and they set to work to ascertain what progress the water was making. It rose for about 5 feet, when it was found to remain stationary. "What is the matter, Dick?" inquired Mrs. Weldon, disturbed by the movements of the men. "Nothing very alarming," answered Dick promptly. "Only some water has found its way into the lower part of the place. It will not reach your upper cells. Probably some river has overflowed its boundaries." "The very river, perhaps," suggested Hercules assuringly. "That is to carry us to the coast." Mrs. Weldon made no reply. Cousin Benedict was still sleeping as soundly as if he were himself a white ant. The Negroes were peering down onto the sheet of water, which reflected back the rays of the lantern, ready to carry out any orders given by Dick, who was quietly gauging the inundation and removing the provisions and firearms out of its reach. Illustration: they set to work to ascertain what progress the water was making. "Did the water get in at the opening, Mr. Dick?" asked Tom. "Yes, Tom, and consequently we are coming to the end of our stock of fresh air," was Dick's reply. "But why should we not make another opening above the water level?" Tom inquired. "A thing to be thought about," said Dick. "But we have to remember that if we have 5 feet of water here inside, there is probably a depth of 6 or 7 outside. In rising here, the flood has compressed the air and made it an obstacle to further progress. But if we allow the air to escape, we may perhaps only be letting the water rise too high for our safety. We are just as if we were in a diving bell." "Then what is to be done?" asked the old Negro. "No doubt," replied Dick, "we must proceed very cautiously. An inconsiderate step will jeopardize our lives." Dick Sands was quite correct in comparing the cone to an immersed diving bell. In that mechanical contrivance, however, the air can always be renewed by means of pumps, so that it can be occupied without inconvenience beyond what is entailed by a somewhat confined atmosphere. But here the interior space had already been reduced by a third part through the encroachment of the water, and there was no method of communicating with the outer air except by opening a new aperture, an operation in which there was manifest danger. Dick did not entertain the slightest apprehension that the ant-hill would be carried away bodily by the inundation. He knew that it would adhere to its base as firmly as a beaver hut. What he really dreaded was that the storm would last so long that the flood would rise high above the plain, perhaps submerging the ant-hill entirely, so that ultimately all air would be expelled by the persistent pressure. The more he pondered, the more he felt himself driven to the conviction that the inundation would be wide and deep. It could not be, he felt sure, entirely owing to the downpour from the clouds that the rapid flood was rising. There must have been the sudden overflowing of some stream to cause such a deluge over the low-lying plain. It could not be proved that the ant-hill was not already underwater, so that escape might be no longer possible, even from its highest point. With all Dick's courage, it was yet evident that he was very uneasy. He did not know what to do, and asked himself again and again whether patient waiting or decisive action would be his more prudent course. It was now about 3 o'clock in the morning. All within the ant-hill were silent and motionless, listening to the incessant turmoil which told that the strife of the elements had not yet ceased. Presently, old Tom pointed out that the height of the water was gradually increasing, but only by very slow ascent. Dick could only say that if the flood continued to rise, however slowly, it must inevitably drive out the air. As if struck by a sudden thought, Bat called out, "Let me try and get outside. Perhaps I might dive and get through the opening." "I think I had better make that experiment myself," answered Dick. "That you never shall," interposed Tom peremptorily. "You must let Bat go. It may not be possible to get back, and your presence is indispensable here. Think, sir, think of Mrs. Weldon and Master Jack," he added in a lower tone. "Well, well," Dick assented, "if it must be so, Bat shall go." And turning to Bat, he continued, "Do not try to come back again. We will try, if we can, to follow you the same way. But if the top of the cone is still above water, knock hard on it with your hatchet, and we shall take it as a signal that we may break our way out. Do you understand?" "All right," he said, "all right, sir." And after wringing his father's hand, he drew a long breath and plunged into the water that filled the lower section of the ant-hill. It was an exploit that required considerable agility. The diver would have to find the orifice, make his way through it, and without loss of a moment, let himself rise to the surface outside. Full half a minute elapsed, and Dick was making sure that the Negro had been successful in his effort when his black head emerged from the water. There was a general exclamation of surprise. "It is blocked up," gasped Bat, as soon as he had recovered breath enough to speak. "Blocked up," cried Tom. "Yes," Bat affirmed. "I have felt all round the wall very carefully with my hand, and I am sure there is no hole left. I suppose the water has dissolved the clay." "If you cannot find a hole," exclaimed Hercules, "I can very soon make one." And he was just about to plunge his hatchet into the side of the ant-hill, when Dick prevented him. "Stop, stop, you must not be in such a hurry." He reflected for a few moments, and went on. "We must be cautious. An impetuous step may be destruction. Perhaps the water is over the top. If it is allowed to enter, then at once is an end of all." "But whatever we do," urged Tom, "must be done at once. There is no time to lose." He was right. The water had risen till it was quite 6 feet deep. None but Mrs. Weldon, Jack, Nan, and Cousin Benedict, who were lodged in the upper cells, were fairly above its surface. Dick now came to his determination. At about a foot above the water level, that is, about 7 feet from the ground, he resolved to bore a hole through the clay. If he should find himself in communication with the open air, he would have the proof he desired that the top of the cone was still uncovered. If, on the other hand, he should ascertain that he had pierced the wall below the surface of the external water, he would be prepared to plug up the hole instantaneously and repeat the experiment higher up. It was true that the inundation might have risen even 15 feet above the plain. In that case, the worst had come, and there was no alternative but that they must all die of asphyxia. Carefully considering the chances of his undertaking, Dick calmly and steadily set about his task. The best instrument that suggested itself for his purpose was the ramrod of a gun, which, having a sort of corkscrew at the end for extracting the wadding, would serve as an auger. The hole would be very small, but yet large enough for the requisite test. Hercules showed him all the light he could by holding up the lantern. There were several candles left, so that they were not in fear of being altogether in darkness. The operation hardly took a minute. The ramrod passed through the clay without difficulty. A muffled sound was distinguished as of air bubbles rushing through a column of water. As the air escaped, the water in the cone rose perceptibly. The hole had been pierced too low. A handful of clay was immediately forced into the orifice, which was thus effectually plugged, and Dick turned round quietly and said, "We must try again." The water had again become stationary, but its last rise had diminished the amount of breathing space by more than 8 inches. The supply of oxygen was beginning to fail, respiration was becoming difficult, and the flame of the candle burned red and dim. About a foot higher than the first hole, Dick now set about boring a second. The experiment might again prove a failure, and the water rise yet higher in the cone, but the risk must be run. Just as the auger was being inserted, a loud exclamation of delight was heard proceeding from Cousin Benedict's cell. Dick paused, and Hercules turned the lantern towards the excited naturalist, who seemed beaming with satisfaction. "Yes, yes, I see it all well enough," he cried. "I know now why the termites left their home. They were wide awake. They were more clever than we are. They knew that the storm was coming." Finding that this was all the worthy entomologist had. Illustration: all fired simultaneously at the nearest boat. To communicate, Dick, without comment, turned back again to his operation. Again the gurgling noise. Again the water's upward rush. For the second time he had failed to effect an aperture to the outer air. The situation was to the last degree alarming. The water had all but reached Mrs. Weldon, and she was obliged to take her boy into her arms. Every one felt nearly stifled. A loud singing was heard in the ears, and the lantern showed barely any light at all. A few minutes more and the air would be incapable of supporting life. One chance alone remained. They must bore another hole at the very summit of the cone. Not that they were unaware of the imminent danger of this measure, for if the ant-hill were really submerged, the water from below would immediately expel the remaining air, and death must be instantaneous. A few brief words from Dick explained the emergency of the crisis. Mrs. Weldon recognized the necessity. "Yes, Dick, do it. There is nothing else to be done." While she was speaking, the light flickered out, and they were in total darkness. Mounted on the shoulders of Hercules, who was crouching in one of the side cells, his head only just above water, Dick proceeded to force the ramrod into the clay, which at the vertex of the anthill was considerably harder and thicker than elsewhere. A strange mingling of hope and fear thrilled through Dick Sands as he applied his hand to make the opening which was to admit life and air, or the flood of death. The silence of the general expectation was broken by the noise of a sharp hissing. The water rose for 8 inches, but all at once it ceased to rise. It had found its level. No need this time to close the orifice. The top of the anthill was higher than the top of the flood, and for the present, at least, they could all rejoice that their lives were spared. A general cheer, led by the stentorian voice of Hercules, involuntarily broke from the party. Cutlasses were brought into action, and the clay crumbled away beneath the vigorous assault that was made upon it. The welcome air was admitted through the new-made aperture, bringing with it the first rays of the rising sun. The summit of the anthill once removed, it would be quite easy to clamber to the top, whence it was hoped they would soon get away to some high ground out of reach of the flood. Dick was the first to mount the summit, but a cry of dismay burst from his lips. A sound only too well known to travelers in Africa broke upon his ear. That sound was the whizzing of arrows. Hardly 100 yards away was a large encampment, whilst in the water, quite close to the anthill where he stood, he saw some long boats full of natives. From one of these had come the volley of arrows which had greeted his appearance above the opening of the cone. To tell his people what had happened was the work of a moment. He seized his gun and made Hercules, Bat, and Aeon take theirs, and all fired simultaneously at the nearest boat. Several of the natives were seen to fall, but shouts of defiance were raised, and shots were fired in return. Resistance was manifestly useless. What could they do against 100 natives? They were assailed on every hand. In accordance with what seemed a preconcerted plan, they were carried off from the anthill with brutal violence, in 2 parties, without the chance of a farewell word or sign. Dick Sands saw that Mrs. Weldon, Jack, and Cousin Benedict were placed on board one boat, and were conveyed towards the camp, whilst he himself, with the 5 Negroes and old Nan, was forced into another, and taken in a different direction. 20 natives formed a bodyguard around them, and 5 boats followed in their rear. Useless though it were, Dick and the Negroes made one desperate attempt to maintain their freedom. They wounded several of their antagonists, and would doubtless have paid their lives as a penalty for their daring, if there had not been special orders given that they should be taken alive. The passage of the flood was soon accomplished. The boat had barely touched the shore, when Hercules with it. Illustration: the giant clave their skulls with the butt end of his gun. Tremendous bound sprang on to the land. Instantly 2 natives rushed upon him. The giant clave their skulls with the butt end of his gun and made off. Followed though he was by a storm of bullets, he escaped in safety and disappeared beneath the cover of the woods. Dick Sands and the others were guarded to the shore, and fettered like slaves. Chapter 7. A Slave Caravan. The storm of the previous night, by swelling the tributaries of the Konza, had caused the main river to overflow its banks. The inundation had entirely changed the aspect of the country, transforming the plain into a lake, where the peaks of a number of anthills were the sole objects that emerged above the watery expanse. The Konza, which is one of the principal rivers of Angola, falls into the Atlantic about 100 miles from the spot at which the Pilgrim was stranded. The stream, which a few years later was crossed by Cameron on his way to Benguela, seems destined to become the chief highway of traffic between Angola and the interior. Steamers already ply upon its lower waters, and probably 10 years will not elapse before they perform regular service along its entire course. Dick Sands had been quite right in searching northwards for the navigable stream he had been so anxious to find. The rivulet he had been following fell into the Konza scarce a mile away, and had it not been for this unexpected attack, he and his friends might reasonably have hoped to descend the river upon a raft, until they reached one of the Portuguese forts where steam vessels put in. But their fate was ordered otherwise. The camp which Dick had descried from the anthill was pitched upon an eminence crowned by an enormous sycamore fig, one of those giant trees occasionally found in Central Africa, of which the spreading foliage will shelter some 500 men. Some of the non-fruit-bearing kind of banyan trees formed the background of the landscape. Beneath the shelter of the sycamore, the caravan which had been referred to in the conversation between Negoro and Harris had just made a halt. Torn from their villages by the agents of the slave dealer Alves, the large troop of natives was on its way to the market of Kazand, thence to be sent as occasion required either to the west coast, or to Nyangwe, in the Great Lake District, to be dispersed into Upper Egypt or Zanzibar. Immediately on reaching the camp, the 4 Negroes and Old Nan were placed under precisely the same treatment as the rest of the captives. In spite of a desperate resistance, they were deprived of their weapons, and fastened 2 and 2, one behind another, by means of a pole about 6 feet long, forked at each end, and attached to their necks by an iron bolt. Their arms were left free, that they might carry any burdens, and in order to prevent an attempt to escape a heavy chain was passed round their waists. It was thus in single file, unable to turn either right or left, they would have to march hundreds of miles, goaded along their toilsome road by the havildar's whip. The lot of Hercules seemed preferable, exposed though undoubtedly he would be in his flight to hunger, and to the attacks of wild beasts, and to all the perils of that dreary country. But solitude, with its worst privations, was a thing to be envied in comparison to being in the hands of those pitiless drivers, who did not speak a word of the language of their victims, but communicated with them only by threatening gestures or by actual violence. As a white man, Dick was not attached to any other captive. The drivers were probably afraid to subject him to the same treatment as the Negroes, and he was left unfettered, but placed under the strict surveillance of a havildar. At first he felt considerable surprise at not seeing Harris or Negoro in the camp, as he could not entertain a doubt that it was at their instigation the attack had been made upon their retreat. But when he came to reflect that Mrs. Weldon, Jack, and Cousin Benedict had not been allowed to come with them, but had been carried off in some other direction, he began to think it probable that the 2 rascals had some scheme to carry out with regard to them elsewhere. The caravan consisted of nearly 800, including about 500 slaves of both sexes, 200 soldiers and freebooters, and a considerable number of havildars and drivers, over whom the agents acted as superior officers. These agents are usually of Portuguese or Arab extraction, and the cruelties they inflict upon the miserable captives are almost beyond conception. They beat them continually, and if any unfortunate slave sinks from exhaustion, or in any way becomes unfit for the market, he is forthwith either stabbed or shot. As the result of this brutality, it rarely happens that 50% of the slaves reach their destination. Some few may contrive to escape, and many are left as skeletons along the line of route. Such of the agents as are Portuguese are, as it may well be imagined, of the very lowest dregs of society, outlaws, escaped criminals, and men of the most desperate character. Of this stamp were the associates of Negoro and Harris, now in the employ of José Antonio Alves, one of the most notorious of all the slave dealers of Central Africa, and of whom Commander Cameron has given some curious information. Most frequently, the soldiers who escort the captives are natives hired by the dealers, but they do not possess the entire monopoly of the forays made for the purpose of securing slaves. The native Negro kings make war upon each other with this express design, and sell their vanquished antagonists, men, women, and children, to the traders for calico, guns, gunpowder, and red beads, or in times of famine, according to Livingstone, even for a few grains of maize. The escort of old Alves' caravan was an average specimen of these African soldiers. It was simply a horde of half-naked banditti, carrying old flintlocked muskets, the barrels of which were decorated with copper rings. The agents are very often put to their wits' end to know how to manage them. Their orders are called in question, halts are continually demanded, and in order to avert desertion, they are frequently obliged to yield to the obstreperous will of their undisciplined force. Although the slaves, both male and female, are compelled to carry burdens whilst on their march, a certain number of porters, called pagazis, is specially engaged to carry the more valuable merchandise, and principally the ivory. Tusks occasionally weigh as much as 160 pounds, and require 2 men to carry them to the depots, whence they are sent to the markets of Khartoum, Natal, and Zanzibar. On their arrival, the pagazis are paid by the dealers according to contract, which is generally either by about 20 yards of the cotton stuff known as maricani, or by a little powder, by a handful or 2 of cowries, by some beads, or if all these be scarce, they are paid by being allotted some of the slaves who are otherwise unsaleable. Among the 500 slaves in the caravan, very few were at all advanced in years. The explanation of this circumstance was that whenever a raid is made, and a village is set on fire, every inhabitant above the age of 40 is mercilessly massacred or hung upon the neighboring trees. Only the children and young adults of both sexes are reserved for the market, and as these constitute only a small proportion of the vanquished, some idea may be formed of the frightful depopulation which these vast districts of equinoctial Africa are undergoing. Nothing could be more pitiable than the condition of this miserable herd. All alike were destitute of clothing, having nothing on them but a few strips of the stuff known as mbuza, made from the bark of trees. Many of the women were covered with bleeding wounds from the driver's lashes, and had their feet lacerated by the constant friction of the road, but in addition to other burdens were compelled to carry their own emaciated children. Young men, too, there were who had lost their voices from exhaustion, and who, to use Livingstone's expression, had been reduced to ebony skeletons by toiling under the yoke of the fork, which is far more galling than the galley chain. It was a sight that might have moved the most stony-hearted, but yet there was no symptom of compassion on the part of those Arab and Portuguese drivers whom Cameron pronounces worse than brutes. Footnote: Cameron says, in order to obtain the 50 women of whom Alves is the owner, 10 villages, containing altogether a population of not less than 1,500, were totally destroyed. A few of the inhabitants contrived to escape, but the majority either perished in the flames, were slain in defending their families, or were killed by hunger or wild beasts in the jungle. The crimes which are perpetuated in Africa by men who call themselves Christians seem incredible to the inhabitants of civilized countries. It is impossible that the government at Lisbon can be aware of the atrocities committed by those who boast of being subject to her flag. Tour du Monde. NB against these assertions of Cameron, loud protestations have been made in Portugal. The guard over the prisoners was so strict that Dick Sands felt it would be utterly useless for him to make any attempt to seek for Mrs. Weldon. She and her son had doubtless been carried off by Negoro, and his heart sank when he thought of the dangers to which too probably she would be exposed. Again and again, he repeated his reproaches on himself that he had ever allowed either Negoro or Harris to escape his hands. Neither Mrs. Weldon nor Jack could expect the least assistance from Cousin Benedict. The good man was barely able to consult for himself. All three of them would, he conjectured, be conveyed to some remote district of Angola. The poor mother, like some miserable slave, would insist upon carrying her own sick son until her strength failed her, and exhausted by her endurances, she sank down helpless on the way. A prisoner and powerless to help, the very thought was itself a torture to poor Dick. Even Dingo was gone. It would have been a satisfaction to have had the dog to send off upon the track of the lost ones. One only hope remained. Hercules still was free. All that human strength could attempt in Mrs. Weldon's behalf, Hercules would not fail to try. Perhaps, too, under cover of the night, it was not altogether improbable that the stalwart Negro would mingle with the crowd of Negroes, amongst whom his dark skin would enable him to pass unnoticed, and make his way to Dick himself. Then might not the two together elude the vigilance of the watch? Might they not follow after and overtake Mrs. Weldon in the forest? Would they not perchance be able either by stealth or by force to liberate her, and once free they would effect an escape to the river, and finally accomplish the undertaking in which they had been so lamentably frustrated? Such were the sanguine visions in which Dick permitted himself to indulge. His temperament overcame all tendency to despair, and kept him alive to the faintest chance of deliverance. The next thing of importance was to ascertain the destination of the caravan. It was a matter of the most serious moment whether the convoy of slaves were going to be carried to one of the depots of Angola, or whether they were to be sent hundreds of miles into the interior to Nyangwe, in the heart of the Great Lake district that Livingstone was then exploring. To reach the latter spot would occupy some months, and to return thence to the coast, even if they should be fortunate enough to regain their liberty, would be a work of insuperable difficulty. He was not long left in suspense. Although he could not understand the half-African, half-Arab dialect that was used by the leaders of the caravan, he noticed that the word Kazund occurred very frequently, and knowing it as the name of an important market in the province, he naturally concluded that it was there the slaves were to be disposed of. Whether for the advantage of the king of the district, or of one of the rich traders, he had no means of telling. Unless his geographical knowledge was at fault, he was aware that Kazund must be about 400 miles from Espal de Londa, and consequently that it could hardly be more than 250 miles from the part of the Konza where they were now encamped. Under favorable circumstances, it was a journey that could not be accomplished in less than 12 or 14 days, but allowing for the retarded progress of a caravan already exhausted by a lengthened march, Dick was convinced that they could not reach the place for at least 3 weeks. He was most anxious to communicate to his companions in adversity his impression that they were not to be carried into the heart of the country, and began to cogitate whether some plan could not be devised for exchanging a few words with them. Forked together, as it has been said, 2 and 2, the 4 Negroes were at the right-hand extremity of the camp, Bat attached to his father, Austin to act Aeon. A havildar with 12 soldiers formed their guard. Dick, at first, was about 50 yards away from the group, but being left free to move about, contrived gradually to diminish the distance between himself and them. Tom seemed to apprehend his intention, and whispered a word to his companions that they should be on the lookout. Without moving, they were all on their guard in a moment. Dick, careful to conceal his design, strolled backward with a feigned indifference, and succeeded in getting so near that he might have called out and informed Tom that they were going to Kazand. But he was desirous of accomplishing more than this. He wanted to get an opportunity of having some conversation as to their future plans, and he ventured to approach still nearer. His heart beat high as he believed he was on the point of attaining his object, when all at once the havildar, becoming aware of his design, rushed upon him like a madman, summoned some soldiers, and with considerable violence sent him back to the front. Tom and the others were quickly removed to another part of the encampment. Exasperated by the rough attack that was made upon him, Dick had seized the havildar's gun and broken it, almost wrenching it from his hands, when several soldiers simultaneously assailed him, and would have struck him down and killed him upon the spot, had not one of the chiefs, an Arab of huge stature and ferocious countenance, interfered to stop them. This Arab was the Ibn Hamish of whom Harris had spoken to Negoro. He said a few words which Dick could not understand, and the soldiers, with manifest reluctance, relaxed their hold and retired. It was evident that although Dick was not to be permitted to hold any communication. Illustration: the start was made. With the rest of his party, orders had been given that his life was to be protected. It was now 9 o'clock, and the beating of drums and the blowing of kudu kudu, a ruminant common in Africa. Horns gave the signal that the morning march was to be continued. Instantly chiefs, soldiers, porters, and slaves were upon their feet, and arranged themselves in their various groups with a havildar bearing a bright-colored banner at their head. The order was given, the start was made. A strange song was heard rising in the air. It was a song, not of the victors, but of the vanquished. The slaves were chanting an imprecation on their oppressors, and the burden of the chorus was that captured, tortured, slain after death they would return and avenge their wrongs upon their murderers. Chapter 8. Notes by the way. The storm of the preceding evening had now passed away, but the sky was still cloudy and the weather far from settled. It was the 19th of April, the time of the massacre, or second period of the rainy season, so that for the next 2 or 3 weeks the nights might be expected to be wet. On leaving the banks of the Konza, the caravan proceeded due east. Soldiers marched at the head and in the rear, as well as upon the flanks of the troop. Any escape of the prisoners, therefore, even if they had not been loaded with their fetters, would have been utterly impossible. They were all driven along without any attempt at order, the havildars using their whips unsparingly upon them whenever they showed signs of flagging. Some poor mothers could be seen carrying 2 infants, one on each arm, whilst others led by the hand-naked children, whose feet were sorely cut by the rough ground over which they had trod. Ibn Hamish, the Arab who had interfered between Dick and the havildar, acted as commander to the caravan, and was here, there, and everywhere, not moved in the least by the sufferings of the captives, but obliged to be attentive to the importunities of the soldiers and porters, who were perpetually clamoring for extra rations or demanding an immediate halt. Loud were the discussions that arose, and the uproar became positively deafening when the quarrelsome voices rose above the shrieks of the slaves. Illustration: if ever the havildar strolled a few yards away, Bat took the opportunity of murmuring a few words of encouragement to this poor old father, many of whom found themselves treading upon soil already stained by the blood of the ranks in front. No chance again opened for Dick to get any communication with his friends, who had been sent to the van of the procession. Urged on by the whip, they continued to march in single file, their heads in the heavy forks. If ever the havildar strolled a few yards away, Bat took the opportunity of murmuring a few words of encouragement to his poor old father, while he tried to pick out the easiest path for him, and to relax the pace to suit his enfeebled limbs. Large tears rolled down old Tom's cheeks when he found that his son's efforts only resulted in bringing down upon his back some sharp cuts of the havildar's whip. Act Aeon and Austin, subject to hardly less brutality, followed a few steps behind, but all four could not help feeling envious at the luck of Hercules, who might have dangers to encounter, but at least had his liberty. Immediately upon their capture, Tom had revealed to his companions the fact that they were in Africa, and informing them how they had been betrayed by Harris, made them understand that they had no mercy to expect. Old Nan had been placed amongst a group of women in the central ranks. She was chained to a young mother with 2 children, the one at the breast, the other only 3 years old, and scarcely able to walk. Moved by compassion, Nan took the little one into her own arms, thus not only saving it from fatigue, but from the blows it would very likely have received for lagging behind. The mother shed tears of gratitude, but the weight was almost too much for Nan's strength, and she felt as if she must break down under her self-imposed burden. She thought fondly of little Jack, and imagining him borne along in the arms of his weary mother, could not help asking herself whether she should ever see him or her kind mistress again. Far in the rear, Dick could not see the head of the caravan except occasionally, when the ground was rather on the rise. The voices of the agents and drivers, harsh and excited as they were, scarcely roused him from his melancholy reflections. His thoughts were not of himself nor of his own sufferings. His whole attention was absorbed in looking for some traces of Mrs. Weldon's progress. If she, too, was being taken to Kazand, her route must also lie this way. But he could discover no trace of her having been conducted by this line of march, and could only hope that she was being spared the cruelties which he was himself witnessing. The forest extended for about 20 miles to the east of the Konza, but whether it was that the trees had been destroyed by the ravages of insects, or broken down before they had made their growth by being trampled on by elephants, they were growing much less thickly than in the immediate vicinity of the river. There were numbers of cotton trees, 7 or 8 feet high, from which are manufactured the black and white striped stuffs that are worn in the interior of the province. But upon the whole, progress was not much impeded either by shrubs or underwood. Occasionally the caravan plunged into jungles of reeds like bamboos, their stalks an inch in diameter, so tall that only an elephant or giraffe could have reared above them, and through which none excepting such as had a very intimate knowledge of the country could possibly have made their way. Starting every morning at daybreak, they marched till noon, when an hour's halt was made. Packets of manioc were then unfastened, and doled out in sparing quantities among the slaves. Sometimes, when the soldiers had plundered some village, a little goat's flesh or some sweet potatoes were added to the meal. But generally the fatigue, aggravated by inadequate rest, took away the appetite, and when mealtime arrived many of the slaves could hardly eat at all. During the first 8 days' march from the Konza, no less than 20 unfortunate wretches had fallen upon the road, and had been left behind, a prey to the lions, panthers, and leopards that prowled in the wake. As Dick heard their roars in the stillness of the night, he trembled as he thought of Hercules. Nevertheless, had the opportunity offered itself, he would not for a moment have hesitated in making his own escape to the wilderness. Illustration: the caravan had been attacked on the flank by a dozen or more crocodiles. The 250 miles between the river and Kazand were accomplished in what the traders call marches of 10 miles each, including the halts at night and midday. The journey cannot be better described than by a few rough notes that Dick Sands made upon his way. Apeth saw a village surrounded with bamboo palisading, 8 or 9 feet high, fields round planted with maize, beans, and sorghum. 2 Negroes captured, 15 killed, rest took to flight. 26th, crossed a torrent 150 yards wide. Bridge formed of trunks of trees and creepers. Piles nearly gave way, 2 women fastened to a fork, one of them carrying a baby, fell into the water. Water quickly tinged with blood, crocodiles seen under bridge, risk of stepping into their very jaws. 28th, crossed a forest of bauhinias, great trees, the ironwood of the Portuguese. Heavy rain, ground sodden, marching difficult. Caught sight of Nan in the middle of caravan. She was toiling along with a black child in her arms, the woman with her limping and blood trickling from her shoulder. 29th. Camp at night under a huge baobab with white flowers and light green leaves. Lions and leopards roaring all night. A soldier fired at a panther. What has become of Hercules? 30th. Rainy season said to be over till November. First touch of African winter. Dew very heavy, plains all flooded. Easterly winds, difficulty of respiration, susceptibility to fever. No trace of Mrs. Weldon, cannot tell whether she is ahead. Fear Jack may have a return of fever. May 5th. Forced to march several stages across flooded plains, water up to the waist, many leeches sticking to the skin, lotus and papyrus upon higher ground. Great heavy leaves, like cabbages, beneath the water make many stumble as they walk. Saw large numbers of little fish, silurus species, these are caught by the natives, and sold to the caravans. 7th. Plains still inundated. Last night no halting place to be found, marched on through the darkness. Great misery. Except for Mrs. Weldon, life not worth having, for her sake must hold out. Loud cries heard. Saw by the lightning, soldiers breaking large boughs from the resinous trees that emerged from the water. The caravan had been attacked on the flank by a dozen or more crocodiles. Women and children seized and carried off to what Livingstone calls their pasture lands, the holes where they deposit their prey until it is decomposed. Myself grazed by the scales of one of them, a slave close beside me torn out of the fork which was snapped in half. How the poor fellow's cry of agony rings in my ear. This morning, 20 missing. Tom and the others, thank God, are still alive. They are on in front. Once Bat made a sharp turn and Tom caught sight of me. Nothing to be seen of Nan. Was she, poor creature, one of those that the crocodiles had got? 8th. After 24 hours in the water we have crossed the plain. We have halted on a hill. The sun helps to dry us. Nothing to eat except a little manioc and a few handfuls of maize. Only muddy water to drink. Impossible for Mrs. Weldon to survive these hardships. I hope from my heart that she has been taken some other way. Smallpox has broken out in the caravan, those that have it are to be left behind. Started at dawn. No stragglers allowed, sick and weary must be kept together by Havildar's whip, the losses were considerable. Living skeletons all round, rejoiced once more to catch sight of Nan. She was not carrying the child any longer, she was alone, the chain was round her waist, but she had the loose end thrown over her shoulder. I got close to her. Suppose I am altered, as she did not know me. After I had called her by name several times she stared at me and at last said, "Ah, Mr. Dick, is it you? You will not see me here much longer." Her cadaverous look pained my very soul, but I tried to speak hopefully. Poor Nan shook her head. "I shall never see my dear mistress again, no, nor Master Jack. I shall soon die." Anxious to help her, I would gladly have carried the end of the chain which she had been obliged to bear because her fellow prisoner was dead. A rough hand was soon upon my shoulder. A cruel lash had made Nan retreat to the general crowd, whilst, at the bidding of an Arab chief, I was hustled back to the very hindmost rank of the procession. I overheard the word negoro, in a way that convinced me that it is under the direction of the Portuguese that I am subject to this hard indignity. 11th. Last night encamped under some large trees on the skirts of a forest. Several escaped prisoners recaptured, their punishment barbarously cruel. Loud roaring of lions and hyenas heard at nightfall, also snorting of hippopotamuses, probably some lake or watercourse not far off. Tired but could not sleep, heard a rustling in the grass, felt sure that something was going to attack me. What could I do? I had no gun. For Mrs. Weldon's sake, must, if possible, preserve my life. The night was dark, no moon, 2 eyes gleamed upon me. I was about to utter a cry of alarm. Fortunately, I suppressed it. The creature that had sprung to my feet was Dingo. The dog licked my hands all over, persisting in rubbing his neck against them, evidently to make me feel there. Found a reed fastened to the well-known collar upon which the initials SV had so often awakened our curiosity. Breaking open the reed, I took a note from inside. It was too dark for me to see to read it. I tried, by caressing Dingo, to detain him, but the dog appeared to know that his mission with me was at an end. He licked my hands affectionately, made a sudden bound, and disappeared in the long grass as mysteriously as he had come. The howling of the wild beasts increased. How I dreaded that the faithful creature would become their prey. No more sleep this night for me. It seemed that daylight would never dawn. At length it broke with the suddenness that marks a tropical morn. I was able cautiously to read my note. The handwriting, I knew at a glance, was that of Hercules. There were but a few lines in pencil. Mrs. Weldon and Jack, carried away in a kitanda. Harris and Negoro both with them. Mr. Benedict too, only a few marches ahead but cannot be communicated with at present. Found Dingo wounded by a gunshot. Dear Mr. Dick, do not despair, keep up your courage, I may help you yet.